brought from the Honourable House of Representatives. Petitions. I'm sorry.
The following is a message from the Speaker of the House of Representatives to the Honourable Senate. I have the honour to advise the Honourable Senate that on the 27th day of May 2020, the House of Representatives agreed to the Senate amendments to a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Registration of Titles Act and for Connected Matters, and a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Registration of Titles, Cadastral Mapping and Tenure Clarification, Special Provisions Act and for Connected Matters. I also have the honour to advise the Honourable Senate that on the 27th day of May 2020, a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act was passed in the House of Representatives. Signed, Pernell P. Charles, CDJP MP, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Mr. President, I signify my willingness to take charge of the bill.
Thank you, Minister.
A bill shortly entitled the Financial Administration and Audit Amendments Act 2020, read a first time.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of second reading of the bill, and I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today I will ask for suspension of the standing orders to allow me to take the bill through its completing stages.
Petitions, papers, reports from committees, notices of motions given orally.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the Senate I will move the following motion. Resolved that the report of the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, which was set up to review and report on the Criminal Justice Suppression of Criminal Organizations Act 2014, which was laid on the table of the Senate on the 29th day of May 2020, be approved.
Thank you, Minister Samuda. Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sitting of the Senate. Motions for leave to introduce bills. The presentation of bills without the leave of the Senate first obtained. Public business. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, given the urgency of the matter, it is proposed today to proceed with the Financial Administration and Audit Amendment Act, and it is hopeful that this will allow us a full and robust proceeding in the chamber today. In that context, Mr. President, I wish to move for suspension of the standing orders to allow me to take the bill, to take the second reading of the bill, notice of which I gave earlier.
You have heard the question. Those in favor? Aye. Against?
Mr. President, as you started the debate this morning by reminding us that we continue to find ourselves in the midst of a pandemic. In fact, Jamaica situates ourselves at 12 weeks and 3 days since our first positive COVID-19 test. It is indeed a concern that perhaps we are victims of our success in that matters have been well managed, our curve is coming down, and the hard work of our public health workers, our security forces, and the policy directive that has been given under the leadership of our Prime Minister, Most Honourable Andrew Holness, as well as our Minister of Health and Minister of Finance, have placed us in a position where there are persons who feel that we are through the worst. But indeed, Mr. President, there is much that needs to be done. We continue to be in the midst of a global pandemic, and it is important that the government act responsibly and appropriately and efficiently in those circumstances. It is in this context that we seek to table and take the short but important bill to amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act 2020. Very quickly, Mr. President, I would just outline that the following are the proposed amendments before us. It is proposed to amend Section 48C(1)(b) of the FAA Act to extend the date to achieve the targeted debt-to-GDP ratio of 60% from March 31, 2026, as it is now, to March 31, 2028. It is further proposed to amend Section 48C(2)(a) to include among the conditions to trigger suspension of the fiscal rules, 1, the declaration of the whole or part of Jamaica as a disaster area or a threatened area under the Disaster Risk Management Act 2015, and the making of an order under Section 16 of the Public Health Act of much greater vintage. Mr. President, fundamentally, the intention is therefore to suspend the fiscal rules by extending the date for achieving the target reduced debt to GDP ratio and to expand the circumstances which trigger the process for suspension of the said rules. Mr. President, it is of course important to us and important for us to understand and appreciate the context within which we are reviewing the bill. The amendments are proposed against the backdrop of the severe disruption to global and domestic economic activities caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. President, as set out by the Minister of Finance, the Honourable Nigel Clarke, on May 13, when he tabled the supplementary budget, the supplementary estimates, Jamaica's revenues are projected to decline by $81 billion, even as we will be required to spend an additional $34 billion for matters related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are earning $81 billion less, but required to spend $34 billion more due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. President, he also indicated that other inflows, the category of other inflows, would also be impacted to the extent of $5 billion Jamaican dollars, so that what Jamaica is facing, and I believe this made a headline or two, Mr. President, is that Jamaica is facing a $120 billion challenge at this time. When he made this presentation, Mr. President, he indicated, not for the first time, that suspending the fiscal rules as part of the government's COVID response would be necessary. And this in the context where it has occurred all across the world in other countries which have fiscal rules and have been impacted by COVID-19. This was at the time and immediately on the day acknowledged by the opposition and even indeed supported by the spokesperson on finance. And the opposition's position was recognized as one that was entirely reasonable and I believe described as mature in some circumstances, given the realities of the pandemic and its projected impact. Mr. President, arising from the disruptions caused by the pandemic, Jamaica's economy is forecast to contract by 5.1% in financial year 2020-2021. And while the budget approved in March was cast against an economic growth expectation of 1.1%, even at the time of tabling of the budget, Mr. President, the inevitability of tabling supplemental budgets was brought to the fore by Minister Clarke. It was clear that there would be significant impact, but like the world, we would need to observe how events would unfold locally and across the globe to get a sense of the extent to which we would be impacted, as this, the world over, has been uncertain. Clearly, Mr. President, we would have had to do some assessment before tabling, and April's performance, and indeed that of March, has clearly given some basis for understanding the impact as we plan to go forward, while of course always recognizing the novelty, Mr. President, as the virus is novel, the novelty of our global and local circumstances. So, Mr. President, Jamaica is already experiencing the fallout as evidenced by the PIOJ's estimated 1.7% real economic contraction announced for the March quarter and their projections for a 12 to 14% decline for the April to June 2020 quarter. Mr. President, this sharp economic contraction projected for the next quarter, and that's for the next quarter alone, Mr. President, will undoubtedly depress the public sector's revenue intake, thereby necessitating sharp cuts in expenditure to maintain debt on a sustainable path. We have to, Mr. President, we have to be able to act sensibly, to act efficiently, and in a balanced way to ensure that the stability we have achieved through the hard work and restraints agreed to by the Jamaican people. Mr. President, so at the same time as we seek to maintain a sustainable path, the state has a responsibility to respond decisively and with alacrity to moderate the impact of the pandemic on our people and on the economy. And the interconnectedness of the two, Mr. President, must always be kept at the forefront of our minds. Lives and livelihoods, people and their well-being are impacted by jobs, employment, the ability to provide services, the ability to access services, and they are all connected. So, Mr. President, within this context, expenditure is, as I've alluded to earlier, required in unprogrammed areas, in particular for health services and the COVID-19 allocation of resources for employees, for example, the CARE program. These will impact directly on people, and our inability to deliver would impact directly on the lives of people. These are not, Mr. President, notwithstanding their technical specificity, they are not esoteric or academic issues. They will have an impact. So the government feels strongly that we need to be in a position to cushion the impact of the pandemic on our most vulnerable people. Families on PATH and vulnerable persons living with disabilities but who are not on the PATH program, for example, expend considerations of this bill. So in respect of the first amendment proposed, which is the extension of the date and the suspension of the fiscal rules, Mr. President, I say for emphasis that the pandemic has wreaked unprecedented economic and fiscal burdens on the country, as it has the world. Against this backdrop, the government will require more time to reduce the public debt to 60% of GDP, while allowing some space for us to respond prudently to the pandemic without compromising our commitment to fiscal responsibility. In this regard, and with the support of the International Monetary Fund, it has therefore been determined to extend the target by 2 years from March 31, 2026 to March 31, 2028. The matter was considered deeply and discussed with the IMF and other key stakeholders before it was fully crystallized in the form of the bill being taken today. You will recall, Mr. President, that in April, we had applied to the IMF for access to more than 500 million United States dollars from the Rapid Relief Fund mechanism that was established and made available in light of the pandemic. Mr. President, in this context, the timing and their buy-in was important to ensuring that we were maintaining the balanced approach for which we continue to strive. As you would be aware, Mr. President, the funds were approved and the suspension proposed as a mechanism by us was endorsed. And so, Mr. President, we now seek to move to implementation as well. Mr. President, allow me to remind that in order for the suspension of fiscal rules to be triggered, the conditions set out in the FAA Act must be met. And this brings us to the second set of amendments proposed today. Mr. President, fundamentally, none of the primary conditions, let us call them the primary conditions, set out in 48C2 of the FAA Act exist today, as provided for in the Act. In the context that the conditions required to trigger suspension of the fiscal rules as outlined are a period of public disaster within the meaning of Section 20 of the Constitution of Jamaica, a severe economic contraction as defined in Section 48A1 of the FAA Act, and it's defined as a decline in gross domestic product over 4 consecutive quarters involving a cumulative reduction that is equal to or greater than 3% of gross domestic product relative to the corresponding quarter of the preceding financial year, or a one-time quarterly reduction in gross domestic product equal to or greater than 2% relative to the corresponding quarter of the preceding financial year. C, a financial sector crisis, Mr. President, and D, a public emergency within the meaning of Section 20 of the Constitution of Jamaica. Mr. President, it is beyond debate, as I have said earlier, that suspension of the rules is required. The question is therefore, how do we get there? As we have already discussed in this House to date, the government has not found that declaration of a public emergency or a public disaster under Section 20 were appropriate paths for us to follow in the circumstances. We have instead, Mr. President, used the 2015 Disaster Risk Management Act, drafted, debated, and passed under the previous administration. Notwithstanding the fact that it mandates no parliamentary approval, the Prime Minister has ensured that in respect of each order declared, he has presented the elements in Parliament for debate and subjected himself and the government indeed to questions on the matter which have been addressed where appropriate. Mr. President, in respect of the other elements, we are not experiencing a financial sector crisis as those are defined technically, nor do we believe, Mr. President, in the urgency of the circumstances that we could wait to fulfill the definition of a severe economic contraction as defined. Mr. President, we recognize that a view has been expressed that it is in fact this definition, the definition of a severe economic contraction, which should be changed. But, Mr. President, I believe the Minister of Finance has expressed in that other place why it is this would not be the best way to go. And indeed, Mr. President, given the technical specificity of that element, the length of time that could be taken possibly to determine an appropriate adjustment if that path were to be pursued, it again is not considered to be the best way forward. Mr. President, on the other hand, you will recall that on Friday, March 13, 2020, indeed 3 days after Jamaica's first COVID case, the Prime Minister declared the whole of Jamaica as a disaster area under the Disaster Risk Management Declaration of Disaster Area Order 2020. The declaration is still in force as we continue to manage the local impact of the pandemic, and accordingly is an existing circumstance. We therefore suggest, Mr. President, it is perhaps the cleanest, clearest, and most efficient amendment which could be pursued to make way for the initiation of the process to suspend the fiscal rules. Again, in a circumstance where every day counts. And Mr. President, allow me to remind, as I did not state it earlier, that the process does not follow immediately upon the passage of this bill. What would then be required as defined under the Act and as would remain unchanged is for the PIOJ to, by letter to the Auditor General, by letter to the auditor, by letter, let me not, is it Auditor General or the Minister?
Auditor General.
To the Auditor General, to indicate which circumstances exist which would require suspension of the rules. After that assessment is done by the Auditor General, Mr. President, it is only then, when that indication has been given, that approval and go-ahead has been given by the Auditor General, that the Minister can then bring an order indicating the suspension. He can bring it to that other place, and it must be affirmed in both houses. So, Mr. President, there are further checks and balances. Not only does the PIOJ have to assess the circumstances, but they must so indicate in writing. The circumstances must be reviewed by the Auditor General, Mr. President, and it is only then that the Minister can act. So there are layers of conduct which not only provide appropriate check and balance, but, Mr. President, they take time. And this is why we have sought in that other place to table and take on the same day. We're seeking to proceed in this manner again today, and on passage of the bill, which we anticipate, hopefully with the support of the opposition, that in recognizing the totality of the circumstances, that in those circumstances we would then proceed for the Minister to issue the relevant orders after the process I've just described takes place. So, Mr. President, allow me to quickly touch on the matter of Section 16, which is another part of the amendment. This is the amendment, again, under 48C2A, where it is sought to include the matter of a declaration under Section 16 of the Public Health Act. Clearly, Mr. President, this is proposed against the backdrop that our current circumstances are in fact caused by a health-related shock. The government is therefore taking a proactive approach to ensure that in the future, howsoever an issue arises regarding a communicable disease, and we recognize that it has been stated time and time again that it is not an unlikelihood or an unlikely set of circumstances that we will experience more pandemics in the future. This is the nature of the world in which we live, and this is one for which we must, as best as possible, prepare for. But, Mr. President, Jamaica must, where such circumstances occur, and Jamaica must take steps to mitigate its spread, which of course may be done lawfully under an order on the Public Health Act. Where this has negative effects on the economy, the FAA, if amended as we put forward today, it would allow for steps to be taken to suspend the fiscal rules if required. So essentially, Mr. President, the intent today, or rather the intent that is already reflected in 48C, is being given full effect, in the sense that it is recognizing the effects of a communicable disease that can negatively and severely impact our economy, that should be one of the triggers for suspending the fiscal rules, and that the different and lawful ways in which a disaster may be declared should also be recognized. So in this context, Mr. President, I believe that it is important that we remain mindful of the range of shocks that can disrupt economic and fiscal activities in our country, and that it is incumbent on us as legislators to ensure that the state is in a position to respond appropriately to mitigate the impact of adverse shocks on the population, such that where the law provides more than one route for protective action to be taken from disaster or health-related perspectives, then the law should also provide for the government to act in response to the economic impact of the same disaster or health-related disruptions. So, Mr. President, as indicated, every day matters, and it is in this context that we seek to not only table but to take this bill through its completing stages today, and in this context I welcome the debate between members of this honourable chamber. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Minister. Senator.
Good morning, everyone. Mr. President, I rise to speak on the bill enacted Financial Administration and Audit Act. Now, this act allows us to suspend the standing orders, not the standing orders, the fiscal rule to allow the deadline for our debt to GDP target to move from the original date of 2026 to a new date of 2028. And the COVID-19 crisis has brought upon us, as my colleagues from the government side stated, an external shock, an external economic shock that requires a carefully thought through approach to finding the solutions to where we need to go. If I read here in the Act, it says that the economy is expected to decline by 5%. But if you can recall that when the government came into power in 2016, they came into power with the premise that in 2020 that we are in now, the economy would be growing by 5%. So this is a typical back way come a front type of thing, where we want, they propose that we would have been growing by 5%, but now our economy is contracting by 5%. And I put it to you, Mr. President, that this has nothing to do with the COVID-19 crisis in its state, but more to do with how we have been managing Jamaica's macroeconomy. And let me explain. We speak about the Ministry of Economic Growth, an economy that you can increase the standard of living of its people. And we hypothesized in 2016 that we wanted to grow by 5%, and in 2020 the economy is declining by 5%. So, I mean, I see the king, I see the queen. I mean, we can talk about some Jack. Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Jack and Jill do too much work, working without the reward. Very similar to the Jamaican people, working without the reward. Jamaica's unemployment rate fell last year to the lowest we have seen. But as we get a crisis, nobody has in their savings account enough money to survive for a month. What kind of economy is this which we live? We need, and let me speak, we need to be able to create wealth. So let me speak of another Jack, because the king is there, the queen is there, we are all Jack. So let me speak of another Jack, Jack and the beanstalk. Now, there was a Jack who went to a market and got some beans. When he planted these beans grew and grew and grew and created wealth for Jack and his family. So what is this? Are we Jack and Jill, or do we aspire to become Jack with the beanstalk? I've been passing out seeds in my constituency. We are looking, cannot expand because we do not have any water. We need water distribution to our rural farmers, because agriculture is what is going to bring us our fortune. Jack and the beanstalk, not Jack and Jill. Jack and the beanstalk, not Jack and Jill. We need to create wealth for our people. We cannot continue in this way. Every country now has found itself in crisis, and every country now is putting measures in place to survive through the crisis and also to increase the amount of economic prosperity of their country. It doesn't make sense we take a Jack and Jill approach towards an economy that needs a beanstalk. And it is important that we understand the analogy that I'm making, because we are spending too much time and effort working out ourselves up the hill, down the hill, up the hill, down the hill, up the hill, down the hill, up the hill. No water in sight. No water in sight. No, the idea here is that we want to create a modern economy. And what I've seen, based on my observation of other countries, is that now they have realized that, yes, the COVID-19 crisis has impacted the economy in a very significant way. But what do? Do we cry? Do we run up and down, oh, we need to contain the crisis? Or do we put structures in place to make sure that the economy can still function and can improve and move forward into the fourth industrial revolution in this time? And that is what we should be focusing on. So half of our time should be spent mitigating the crisis and the impact of the crisis, but half of our time should also be spent putting things in place so that we can take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution and survive after the crisis. We need to create wealth, Mr. Speaker, and a country like Jamaica has the ability to create wealth, but we have been stuck in a Jack and Jill approach, and because we believe that the Jack and the Beanstalk is a magician story. Jamaica can create magic. The world has seen Jamaica done so before. All it takes to create magic, the hand is quicker than the eye. Magic is nothing supernatural. Magic is just something that you do that you have never done before. Jamaica's economy can create magic, and we have the ability to do so. Now, I'm going through the supplementary budget, and I'm reading here that the expected fall in GDP, this is expected to have an adverse consequence on public sector revenue stream, thereby necessitate sharp cuts in expenditure.
Senator.
Sharp cuts in expenditure.
Senator Harton.
Yes.
Senator Harton.
A point of order, because I am just trying to decipher what is Mr. President.
Rubbish is the rubbish in the state.
Senator Harton. Senator Harton, just to say to you that there are certain terms that appear on Parliament.
Okay, rubbish.
May I proceed? May I proceed?
Nothing wrong with that.
Thereby necessitating a sharp cut in expenditure. So I'm looking at the budget and I'm looking at debt servicing. And originally we planned 287.8 billion for debt servicing. It has now gone up to 295. What we're seeing is that interest charges on the debt has increased from 132 million, or what is it, 132 billion, sorry, to 137 billion. This increase appears to me, Mr. That. Pardon? You tell what is?
Listen, what is that?
What am I saying?
Start over, make we
The public debt servicing has increased from the interest charges from 132 billion to 137 billion dollars.
5 billion more.
5 billion more. And we said here in the act we want a sharp cut in expenditure. So this is saying to us that there are some expenditures of which we have control and some that we do not have control. Our debt servicing, we don't have any control. Why? Because much of the factors that impact this debt servicing has been. So we have to look at this debt and say, okay, what are we losing when the exchange rate depreciate from 135 to 145? $10 depreciation. What are we losing when the exchange rate depreciate from 130 to 145? Because this is important for us to understand that in an economy like Jamaica's, we need to see where we are moving in the right direction. And it cannot be a 360. Last year, oh, Jamaica, this, that, and then this year, Jamaica,
No, can't have it.
That's not robust. That is not robust. As macroeconomists, we have to be talking about how do we create robustness in our economy. How do we create robustness in our economy? And this brings us to monetary policy, because even though we are discussing the fiscal rule, because it's obviously pervasive implications straight across the board, we can speak about monetary policy. The Bank of Jamaica's target rate is 0.5%. In America, their target rate is more than 1%. which means that you can borrow short term in Jamaica for 0.5% and reinvest it abroad for 1% and make arbitrage in a day. Hypothetically, look, every one of us invests in 3 instruments. Domestic instruments in domestic dollars, domestic instruments in foreign dollars, and foreign instruments in foreign dollars. Yes. If the interest rate on domestic instruments are too low or below that which is being paid on foreign instruments, then we are going to move capital from domestic instruments to foreign instruments. What does this entail? This entails moving money from one asset class to the other. And that now is going to put pressure on the exchange rate, and this is what we need to address. Now, the idea here is that the COVID-19 crisis has brought upon us a supply-oriented shock that has minimized supply around the world. In this case, many countries have been doing things to increase their own domestic supply. And I also think that Jamaica too should be doing things to increase its own domestic supply. I mean, a lot of the things that we normally get from China, we can't get. A lot of the things that a lot of countries used to get from China, they can't get. Which means that Jamaica is going to be a critical player in the global production cheaper. Jamaica could be producing more mass. And this 5% backward economic growth of which we speak, we would be in a better position because now we would input in our production process a lower cost to our people. And it is important. It is important because the crisis that we face, now, this is the news, Mr. President. Abroad, this is the news. I read the news. This is the news abroad. Headline news. Oil prices fall. Gas prices fall. But people don't have anywhere to go. People don't have anywhere to go. They are quarantined. Oil price fall. Gas price fall. People don't have nowhere to go. That is the news of foreign. What's Jamaica news now? Oil price fall. Gas price up. People have to stay home to save their money. That makes sense in our time like this?
Absolute rubbish.
It don't make no sense. It don't make any sense. The news should read oil prices down, gas prices down, Jamaica productivity and production gone up. That is what the news should read. A jack and the Jill them. Up the hill, tumble down the hill with a pail of water. People them dead for thirst. Jack and Jill them, man. Oil prices, the lowest ever in the world. Oil prices, the lowest. I'm an economist and I study oil prices, teacher. The lowest I've ever seen it. I'm expecting Jamaica to respond. Give me a break, I can make some more mass, increase my profit margin, can pay some tax next year, and then give me a chance, and then now give me no chance.
Not giving us any chance.
We need a chance, man. We need a chance. And agriculture, because this is the point I am coming at. This 5.1% decline in the economy is occurring at a time when there's an increase in the agriculture contribution to GDP. So GDP fall by 1.1% over the last quarter, while agriculture increased by 7%. What does that mean? The IMF last year said that whenever agriculture expands in Jamaica, because of its severe forward and backward linkages. And let me explain what are linkages. Linkages are the connections of an industry to other industries. So backward linkages are where the inputs are coming from. So for example, agriculture, seeds are linkages, soils are linkages, the labor is linkages, fertilizer, down to the sunshine is a backward linkage. Now the forward linkage is where this is going. Is it going into manufacturing? Is it going to the market? Is it going to the hotel? Where is it going? So the point is, we want to expand our economy, and it has to come through agriculture. I know the economy locked down. We're not fool. But at the same time, we should take this opportunity from where we are to say, okay, let us expand our water resources. Let us expand our infrastructure. Let us use this time now to build out so that we can, one, distribute water to everyone, two, reduce the cost of electricity to everyone. We have to take economic development seriously. We have to take where the country is going seriously. And we have to understand that as a country, although many of us are caught up in the rhetoric of just following through the motion, in order for us to create a modern macroeconomy, we need more than just following through the motion. We need clear thoughts and approach to reducing the cost of energy, to distributing water. I mean, I'm a caretaker for a constituency in West Central St. James, and every time we have to chuck water to people. And I'm saying to myself, why every minute we have to chuck water, we will end up chuck so much. The money that we used to chuck water, if we add them up, we could have used them, create a more sustainable water distribution process for everyone. And why are we not doing this? 4 years, all we talk, oh, we want to grow the economy, we want to reduce jobs. Yes, you have been very successful at reducing jobs because you give Jack and Jill the work to carry the thing up the hill. But the economy can't grow.
Very successful in reducing the jobs. And then
anything you want to do, man. You have been very successful.
Senator.
So you increase, you give people jobs. When you give people jobs, Jack and Jill carry the pail up the hill. No water not come down back. What's the sense then go up the car?
Poverty increase.
Underemployment of our labor. Underemployment of our labor. Underemployment of our labor. We need Jack and the Beanstalk. We don't need a Jack and the Jill. Underemployment of our labor. And I'm going through the budget, the supplementary budget. I'm looking to access at finance. Access to finance in MSMEs. That is our small businesses. People them who are the backbone of modern economic growth. Access to finance fall by 280 million. What are we doing? Why not budget? Why not spending money for?
Finance from businesses?
MSME, for them.
That is small and micro
enterprises.
It has fallen.
280 million. And them are the backbone. Me are looking at budget for some substantial things, healthcare and hospital, and something where government supposed to provide. Me nah see the thing them so substantial. Wanna make we take the people them country serious no man. Make we take the thing serious at the fiscal rule this we are suspending now. You know much hard work, how much work going to creating this fiscal rule, man. Which means that we have to understand that if we are going to adjust it in the most marginal way, it must be very, very substantial. I mean, guys, they're changing government. Changing government. The economy wants better management. Better management. And there's nothing wrong, you know. It's just a difference in our understanding of which fable we should read. It's just a look. And I can look. Let me show now. Let me show now thing. See? Let me discuss something with you. Last year, August, I wrote an article. In the Jamaica Gleaner. Yes. Last year, August. And the title of the article is that it says a global recession is looming in 2020. Which means that the average global modern macroeconomist knew that, when you can go search up on the internet, man, knew that there was going to be a recession in 2020. That was average. August. The average economist, my teacher, was understand the global modern economy. As well as people who read a lot. We know that there was a recession pending in 2020. Why? Global geopolitical occurrences between the United States and China. England leaving the EU, which is Brexit. Germany, there was a fall in demand for their automobiles. And fundamentally, there was a backward bending yield curve indicating that short-term instruments were more valuable than long-term instruments. And we spoke about it, which means that Jamaica, as a small island developing state, know that anything that happens in America reach them. So they should be taking the necessary precautionary measures from last year, August, to create a robust economy so that when it comes to 2020, the spillover has minimized. But we get caught off balance 2020 down to the budget where we read. We know it's a COVID virus there in our world, and we read a budget in a March without nothing about COVID virus in our March also. Look, man, I'm showing that thing. You see, as long as we not address the water crisis, as long as we not address the energy crisis, we can't grow. And we want to stop up a mentality and work out with people. And work them out without no meaningful reward. We are no Jack and Jill.
What was it?
We want meaningful reward. We want meaningful reward. Look at it now. Tourism in a shambles. My entire constituency now under pressure. Hey, the constituency under pressure. Let me tell you now. Entire constituency. These agents coordinate their activities to achieve macroeconomic stability, macroeconomic growth, and macroeconomic development. But I put it to you that if you focus on just growth, if you focus on job creation, you will never grow how you want to and develop how you want to, because that is what we have been doing, putting our people to work underemployed. In order for us to grow sustainably, in order for us to develop, we have to overemploy and create wealth and create value. Move away from the Jack and Jill mentality. Get to Jack and the Beanstalk and let Jamaica grow and flourish. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Horton. Thank you, Senator Horton.
Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize Senator Webby.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much, Mr. President. My good friend Senator Horton, I'm sure you remember the days when I chaired the Economic Policy Committee of the PSOG and you were a contributing member. You did a very good job, I must say. But I think you have to take economics to a higher height with Jack and Jill, because I was really struggling to follow. But I'm sure that you will afford me the chance to sit down one-on-one with you and go through it a little closer. I must confess, Lambie, I don't. Mr. President, I rise to contribute to the debate on the bill shortly entitled the Financial Administration Audit Amendment Act. And this is really to extend the debt to GDP ratio by 2 years to March 31st, 2028. Mr. President, as we stand here today, I think none of us could have predicted that we'd be living through a pandemic that has created a devastating social, political, and economic crisis all over the world. Mr. President, if you listen carefully to the International Monetary Fund, the voice of the economy for the world, they describe, Senator Brown, the economic fallout from COVID-19 as worse than the Great Depression and far worse than the global financial crisis of 2008. The cumulative loss to global GDP over 2020 and 2021 could amount to $9 trillion, 9 with a T trillion dollars. So I don't think it's really debatable, colleagues, senators, and president, that the world is in one of the worst economic crises that we have seen ever. And of course, a small island like Jamaica is going to be impacted significantly. As you have heard, the PIOJ, 5.2% reduction in GDP. And if we're looking forward, we could have a second quarter decline. I think the leader said it, of between 12 to 14%. And in any quarter, Senator Skeffrey, that is significant. That's what they call a body blow to an economy. When you look at our year-over-year revenues, we're talking about an $81 billion loss in revenues. $81 billion loss in revenues. And our debt servicing is expected to climb to by 7.9 billion. And you know, as we speak here, and Senator Hutton, you spoke about your constituency. And Senator Crawford, I know you're feeling this. That 120,000 workers in the tourism sector have lost their jobs. I was telling Senator Sinclair that I went to Montego Bay last week or the week before on business. And I couldn't believe that I was in Montego Bay. It was like a ghost town on Bristol Avenue, the Jamaica Boulevard. Senator says, I couldn't believe it. There's no economic activity. President, I could only find one place that was open, and that was a Starbucks to get a cup of coffee in the morning. Everything was closed in Montego Bay. And then when you look at the efforts of the government, we're 403,000 applicants were received for the state's compassionate grant. One can argue that this is a government that don't care about the poor. 403,000 received compassionate grants. Mr. President, in listening to the debate, and I must confess I saw a different side of my good friend, Minister Nigel Clark, which I thought was quite good. I noted.
Side or the debate?
I saw the passion and the belief in himself in terms of what he was doing, and I respect that. Senator Scott Motley, but there's one thing that was clear. I think that there was a consensus on both sides that the country is in an economic crisis, and we are facing unprecedented times. I saw that. I know, and it's worthy for debate, that we speak about consultation and collaboration, and that's worthy for debate. I'm not going to argue with that point. But one of the things, and I think it should be said a little more, and I'm sure, Senator Skeffrey, you probably would have picked it up, that our Minister of Finance, Nigel Clark, actually proposed 2 years ago to establish a fiscal council to provide strong oversight of the fiscal rules law. Right. The point is that it was established 2 years ago, and there was wide consultation with the private sector and with the opposition, Senator Scott Motley, and also the diplomatic community about this fiscal council. All I'm saying is that this is a council that we should focus on and establishing as quickly as possible and pass the necessary legislation. Mr. President, I think no one can argue that the decision that we are facing is obviously not an easy one. Jamaicans over the years, we have worked very hard, and we have made sacrifices to bring the debt to GDP ratio, Senator Hill, to what we call a manageable level. But the truth is, in terms of what is happening in the world and in Jamaica, no Jamaican government have ever faced a situation like this in terms of a crisis. And I believe that this government, led by Prime Minister Holness and his cabinet, are doing a very good job in steering the country through this crisis. That is my opinion. I would also like to say, and I heard Senator Houghton, and I know he knows the numbers very well. Senator Houghton, we had reserves, as you know, going into this year's budget program, cash reserves of $70 billion. 70 billion. That 70 billion is a testament to the proper management of the economy. That's why you have that surplus. Can you imagine if we had the COVID-19 5 years ago? As my grandma would say, dog, your mouth supper. So we are so we are in a relatively good position, right? And if you want an external view, Senator Crawford, it's not me say so, but the managing director, and I'm going to quote, of the IMF, said, I highly value Jamaica's sound economic reforms and fiscal management in response to the COVID-19 crisis. It's not me saying that, it's the IMF saying that, the managing director. President, I'm going to say it again. I highly value Jamaica's sound economic reforms and fiscal management in response to the COVID-19 crisis. The IMF, Senator Horton, also went on to say that domestic and international policy responses need to be large, and for me this is very important, rapidly deployed, and speedily recalibrated as new data becomes available. Rapidly deployed. Mr. President, the emphasis on speed. The effects of COVID-19 are changing quickly, and the government needs to respond in a similar manner. When we talk about $34 billion of new expenditure set out in the supplementary estimates that will support the government response to assist people who have lost their jobs, the poor and the vulnerable, and provide much needed healthcare services. Delaying is dangerous. Delaying is dangerous. When people cannot find food to eat and pay their bills, delaying is dangerous. Mr. President, when you're facing a crisis, and I know Senator Hill as a banker will appreciate this, you must do what you call what-if scenarios. What-if scenarios. You need to do risk-based needs management, right? By the way, Lambert, Senator Brown, we don't even talk about the upcoming hurricane season. What happens if that comes? We don't even talk about that yet. That if a hurricane season comes in June 1st, what will happen? That is part of doing a risk-based analysis, a what-if scenario. And when you look at a risk-based scenario, you look at the gaps that you have, and the gaps must include your financial requirements. When you determine those requirements, then you say, how are you going to fund it? How are you going to fund it? Mr. President, I like to use this anomaly in terms of a crisis. And as we had said before, and the IMF said it, rapidly deployed. Time is of essence. You delay a day. It could be worse, even an hour. I like to use the one. It's like a pilot, Mr. President, flying a plane. And he meet up on some significant turbulence. He has a split decision, time in terms of timing. Look on Captain Sully, the big mover with the US Airlines, who saved 151 lives. Flight 1549. If you don't have, Mr. President, decisive leadership and quick action when you have a crisis, this country is going to have a problem. And I want to congratulate Minister Nigel Clark for his quick action and response in terms of dealing with this crisis. And I'm sure to get back up, Senator Horton, they're going to need help. If these small businesses in the tourist sector is going to get back up on their feet, as I said, I was in Moby and it closed, they're going to need help. And there are hundreds and hundreds of small businesses that are looking forward to these grants. And they cannot be paid. They cannot be paid until this process is completed. They cannot be paid until the supplementary budget is formally approved. So what we're saying here, we're going to delay payment on these small businesses and these poor people and the tourism things suffer. No man, come on, that don't make sense. We need to move quickly. And there's an example with the EU, European Union. where they move quickly and their member states can now access additional funding. Before I close, and they have fiscal rules, but they have gone through the process very quickly to ensure that they can relax those fiscal rules, absolutely, so they can continue. One of the things that I want to raise before I close is the whole issue of Lambert, Senator Brown, is the whole issue of economic recovery. In any ratio that you discuss, there's a denominator and a numerator, as my mathematician would say. We're spending a lot of time, quite rightly so, discussing the debt. But what we need to also put in our debate and our discussion as a nation is to discuss post-COVID and how we're going to grow the Jamaican economy so we can come out stronger. I'm supporting the whole issue and the notion of having a discussion of how to grow. Let me finish. So Senator Scott Motley, I understand that there was a you obviously don't understand economics either, Lammy. You obviously don't understand economics. So, Mr. President, my call is that I know that the Prime Minister established post-economic recovery team and is being chaired by Nigel Clark, right? I'm calling on the Minister and the government to be more vocal in terms of what these sectors are doing to get the economy back on track. I didn't read the Glean editorial. So I believe that the minister, I believe Mr. President and colleagues, I believe Minister and colleagues, senators, that Minister Clark should give frequent updates on what is happening with the tourism, with the recovery plan, and share it with the nation so we can understand. Senator Brown, I'm happy that you agreed with me on one thing. So, Mr. President, in closing, I want to offer my support for the bill, and I want to congratulate the Minister of Finance for his excellent work that he has been doing in managing the economy. Mr. President, we have overcome many challenges as a country. We have overcome many challenges as a country. And I'm confident that if we work together, we can emerge stronger from the crisis. Mr. Senator Brown, I was hoping that you'd let me finish my presentation with respect. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Webby. Senator Scott Motley.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to make my contribution to this debate on an act to amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act. Before I do so in terms of the act, I want to say to the people of Jamaica as to whether or not a family member in a vulnerable group might be afflicted. There are many persons who don't know where the next meal is coming from. And in the context of the decisions we have to take here today, I remember the explanation given by a shopkeeper in St. Mary who says that people come to buy breakfast, then they come to buy lunch, and then they come to buy dinner. And the reasons are numerous. One, because they don't have a fridge in which to store it. Two, because they don't know whether they will make enough money to afford it. This pandemic, Mr. President, has revealed much more about how our people live than even those of us who are close to the people had ever recognized. And there are some things which we will have to do in the future. So it is not just to innovate and to create, but it is to restore and respect what it is, how it is that our people live. Now, Mr. President, I say all of that to say that I understand perfectly why this amendment to the legislation has to be brought. There is no way that the target which had been set, the target of reduction of public debt to 60% of GDP on March 31st, 2026 could have been met. And I have to ask myself, as I contemplate this, whether even the new target is a realistic one. But I'm sure Senator Hill, Mr. President, will address that. I, for my own part, as somebody who is not an economist, it seems like a very short time frame. And it does not appear to me as though the colossal situation in which we have found ourselves has actually been evaluated. 2 years, Senator Webby, 2 years? But I await the report of the experts on that matter. You know, Mr. President, a new style has developed where private conversations are discussed publicly. And so you will forgive me if I embrace the private conversations which were held and acknowledge that the Shadow Minister of Finance actually alerted the Minister of Finance to the fact that this legislation needed to be brought. This is what you want to speak now.
Yes, just on a point of order, right. The record will show that the minister had indicated from when he tabled the budget, Mr. President, not the supplementary, the budget, that it was possible that not only that supplementary estimates would need to be taken, but also that we would need to suspend the fiscal rules. So the fact that any letter may have been written by the opposition spokesperson was not to alert the minister of what was necessary, and in fact it came after an announcement he made.
Very interesting information.
I thank the minister. I thank the minister for clarifying.
1 minute.
I was actually listening to the Minister of Finance when he referenced the matter. So if I misunderstood his observation about the note which was sent the Wednesday and about the subsequent conversation, I don't think I should be held entirely responsible. But he seemed to be not just passionate, as Senator Webby pointed out, and perhaps in his passion, the way in which he interrupted the Minister of Finance while he was speaking gave the listening public the wrong impression of the sequence. So, Mr. President, as it has never been my style to attempt to misrepresent what anybody says, it has never been my style. If I have misunderstood the Minister of Finance, then the persons listening to what he said can be the judge.
The truth is that
Suffice it to say,
that was already.
suffice it to say, Mr. President, that there is nobody who would not have anticipated not just supplementary estimates as is the norm, but almost anticipated that the budget would have to be recast in certain areas. In fact, the only thing that surprises me is a great haste. That we can't take another day. It must be done now, because indeed and in fact, schools were closed in Jamaica from the 12th of March, 2020. Schools were closed. The first order under the Disaster Risk Management Act was gazetted on the 13th of March. So prudent. Mr. President, I have to make an observation on the route that has been chosen. Not because I consider myself to be brighter than anybody else. I did not know that was the basis on which we made our contributions and on which we collaborated. I thought we had a respectful relationship where the opposition and the government could, on matters of national interest, share ideas. And certainly I speak for my own self, that in the Senate here, more and more so, as time has passed, that is what I've observed. I have observed a respectful relationship, especially when we are crafting legislation, where observations are taken on board. Sometimes they are not. Indeed, you know, Mr. President, I recall when the Minister of Finance attracted my attention, because although he sat on that side, he actually sided and voted with the opposition. And I had to take a close look at this gentleman, because I don't know if it happened a long time ago. Perhaps it did. But I noted it because it was unusual in the context of what was happening.
Nigel was better than this Nigel.
And it would be a good thing. It would be a good thing if we could see those kinds of departure, which shows a level of independence from what your government is doing, is always admirable and commendable. So I go to my point, Mr. President. One of the amendments which is being sought here today is to incorporate into Section 48C an addition that the declaration of a disaster area or threatened area under the declaration of a disaster area or threatened area under Section 26 of the Disaster Risk Management Act and the making of an order under Section 16 of the Public Health Act. But it is important to note the provisions of the section which is being amended, because in 20 of the Constitution of Jamaica. And I want us to look at Section 20, because as I've said publicly, if there was ever a moment contemplated by the Constitution, it was a moment such as this. And the proclamations that can be made, the proclamation of a public disaster made under Section 22C provides that if the Governor General is satisfied that a period of public disaster as a result of the occurrence of any earthquake, hurricane, flood, fire, outbreak of pestilence, outbreak of infectious disease or other calamity.
What kind of disease?
Outbreak of infectious disease or other calamity. This is what he needs to be satisfied about to make this proclamation. this is what he needs to be satisfied about. Indeed, Mr. President, through Senator Orbin, referring to Senator Orbin Hill, your fiscal instructions which are issued under this legislation introduces the whole concept by saying that the Constitution of Jamaica and the Financial Administration and Audit Act lay down the basic principles for the management of public money. And he goes on to talk about transparency and accountability and all of those noble pursuits which we hold dear. Now let me be clear. I am not saying that under the Disaster Risk Management Act there is no provision for illness or any kind of outbreak of disease, although it doesn't put it quite at that level. But you have to understand the philosophy behind the DRMA. Before Gilbert, hurricanes were something that we only sat around and spoke about. Not many of us had ever experienced it. And in fact, much to my dismay, people were... Pardon me, sir?
You and I experienced it.
No, not me. You keep on thinking that I'm as old as you, Mr. President, but I don't reach there yet, and I don't want you to hurry me. I'm getting there very steadily. Do not hurry me. No, I had not. I have no recall of that storm, Mr. President. What year was it? I didn't think I was born. I thought it was, just barely in a state to not even could recognize that there was one. But the fact of the matter, Mr. President, is that in 1989, when people heard a hurricane coming, those people who were not discerning were actually excited at the thought, until Gilbert swept across the country and made some of us never want to eat bully beef again. In 2004, we had Ivan. And that is when the People's National Party, who was then government, declared a state of emergency. In fact, it was very proactive, because what Prime Minister Patterson did is that he shut down the grid, the electricity grid, because he didn't want it to be damaged. He called out the soldiers because he didn't want any looting to take place. It lasted 4 days. Well, you would think that was the end of that. Except 2007, what was Dean? 2007 we had Dean. And that is when we called another state of emergency. That state of emergency called by Prime Minister Portia Simpson Miller lasted 2 days. The opposition nearly crucified her for calling that state of emergency. There were hosts of protest that having a state of emergency 2 days during a hurricane would sully our international reputation. And the then Minister of Tourism, Minister Aluna Samba, had to actually reassure the nation that the 2-day state of emergency was not going to hurt the country. So there's a precedent, and there's a process. Now, the reason why I reference it, Mr. President, is because rising out of the frequency of these events, so you see there's a change. We are on a different trajectory now. And understanding that with climate change, the possibilities were becoming more frequent, we decided that we had to look at the Parish Disaster Act and that we needed to strengthen it and create an architecture, a more efficient architecture for managing events of this kind. After consultation and discussion, we passed the Disaster Risk Management Act. And it's a very elaborate structure. You have the council, you have ODPEM, you have your parish disaster committees, you have the involvement of people at every single level. Such was the nature of the situation. You had to have a plan. You had to identify your shelters. You had to have a program for evacuation and so on. Very, very detailed legislation. It was not intended, it was not crafted to deal with COVID-19. There's no question in my mind. And as the Attorney General has said, there are different legal minds and different legal opinions. I share mine. I share mine.
And I trust yours. I trust yours.
If I have said it, Mr. President, even to much criticism from persons who are supportive of the opposition, I said that the way for the government to proceed is by declaring a state of public disaster, and I stand by it. If we had done that, or the amendment to this legislation would only have been to change the date of the fiscal target. That's the only amendment we would have taken. And I want Senator Albin here to challenge me on that. We have had to,
not effectively.
No, you can't much now.
That's what I'm saying.
You can't much now.
You will lose, but you will challenge.
Mr. President, see your hand on there. I'm waiting.
I'm trying to protect you from Senator Brown.
I found out we share the same anniversary. So we are bonded. We have a bonding. So just for today, you know, it's just for today we're having this love fest. It's not a permanent thing.
Appreciated her day, that's why.
So, Mr. President, we would have been able to recognize the period of public disaster within the meaning of Section 20 of the Constitution of Jamaica as being applicable. But we couldn't do that. I have a theory. If we had not had a state of public emergency as a crime-fighting tool, there would have been no hesitation in the declaration of the state of public disaster.
I agree with you.
But Mr. President, I want to make it very, very clear that Constitution is the supreme document. And where there are constitutional provisions, it is not the norm to go to ordinary legislation. You had the provision.
But some people don't respect the Constitution. Right? Some people don't respect the Constitution.
I gather that it is being seen that the opposition has a different philosophy and an ideology. And therefore we are proceeding along these grounds because we have a different philosophy and ideology. Mr. President, I came to the conclusion that the reference was to the different route on which we would have embarked. And the route on which we would have embarked and was made elusive by the speakers is to use the route of the Constitution. I trust that the words which were spoken were not deeply felt, not deeply meant, or not chosen with care. Because I would like to believe that the philosophy and the ideology which governs this country is a shared ideology by the government and the opposition. And that is to understand the role of the Constitution in a democracy. I would be dismayed I would be dismayed if there was a feeling that the opposition was only making a recommendation because they have a different philosophy and a different ideology. And I hope that when the opportunity comes, there will be some clarification from the person who said it and who was clearly anxious and agitated by the circumstances. You know, Mr. President, I don't know if I really belong in the political space. Sometimes I question it myself. Because I frankly, honestly, and earnestly believe that when we collaborate, we have better results. I have seen it here. And when were you saying something, Minister?
No.
Well, oh wait, you're closing, you can respond to me. When
I am moving the motion today.
When the view is being proffered that the opposition, because they want to consider, probably make some recommendations or some other suggestion, is being obstructive, then it undermines the very essence of a collaborative approach, which is necessary when we have, not just when we have, but specifically when we have a crisis such as the one that we are presently embarked on. So we have a challenge of $120 billion challenge. The contraction, when we get the next report on the quarter, we are going to have a significant decline in revenue. We know that already. We know we put everything in place to make the economy to acknowledge the work of the students like at UTech, who are building all kinds of things, who are doing ventilators, who are doing shields. It has brought out a level of creativity in our Jamaican people, which is admirable. And I predict, Mr. President, that the longer we go in this crisis, is the more you're going to see innovation, creativity. You know which one impressed me? When the Prime Minister said that we should wear masks in the bars. And by the next day, Mr. President, zip. There was a zip. And overnight, a woman was making masks with zips so you could wear it when you go drinking. So, Mr. President, I know state of emergency, yes, it can. When it's the right thing to do. Yes, it can. When it's the right thing to do. And I want the records to show that I believe that it is so. Mr. President, we are going into hurricane season. We are going. We are going into the hurricane season shortly. And that will demonstrate to the country how the Disaster Risk Management Act is going to operate. You are going to see every level of precaution activated. You're going to hear ODPEM's name. In all of this COVID crisis, although the Disaster Risk Management Act has been used, you have not heard ODPEM play any role. There have been.
We don't hear them, but I'm just saying. You don't hear them. You must see on the press conference.
You are going to see all the levels of the Disaster Risk Management Act activated. And then Mr. President, the public can judge, because the activity which has taken place by the government is under Section 26(1), where the Prime Minister declared the entire island a disaster area and thereafter issued a number of orders. I want to bring to the Minister's attention that the parish courts right now are struggling with some of the charges which have been made under the legislation, Senator Sinclair. Perhaps you have had that experience. If you don't go and plead guilty, they don't know what to do. And I'm not saying it without authority. I'm saying it because I know that I'm not going to go to the judge, because the process does not start with the judge. The process of prosecuting a matter, the judge's role is only to make a decision and a determination and to respond to submissions if they are made. So, Mr. President, the future is ahead of us. And the last comment that I would make is that when you're crafting legislation, you have to remember it's not for today, it's not for tomorrow, it's not for the person or the personality sitting in the seat. Sometimes you have to think about the worst, whether the worst person, the most obstinate, arrogant person is in that chair, and how they will use it. So you do a worst case scenario, a present scenario. Senator Webby, I look to you for the correction if it must be there. But you have to cast all your different scenarios, and you anticipate it, and you make the appropriate modifications depending on what. So I say, time will tell. Mr. President, I will support it. It won't be the first time that I've supported something in the Senate for the good of the country, although personally I believe it's the wrong route. It won't be the first time. The Minister knows that well because I've confided in her some of the challenges which I've experienced. I want to share, I told the Attorney General, since now it has become, it wasn't a private conversation, it was in a meeting, says, need to be taken into account, unintended consequences. Because we might have a nobility of purpose. We might have an intent of urgency for good purpose. But unintended consequences are something which we must always bear in mind, if it pleases you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Scott Motley. Sorry. Senator Sinclair.
No. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to express my full support for the passage of this bill. And I want to make it clear, too, because I pick up a little argument that speaks of form, and in the other place there was a long debate about delay for discussion and dialogue, and whether it should have been done there then. But my support is that only in respect to the bill per se, but that we're going to deal with it today and get it passed, because there can be no delay in this particular matter. Mr. President, my position is quite simple. And as I said, I started out by saying that I observed and viewed and reviewed the debate that took place in the other place. And having digested the gravamen of the presentations made by the opposition, some of them, we hear them today, it's clear that the opposition is one with the government on the need to adjust the debt to GDP target by 2 years. That does not seem as if there is any issue at all. No issue. You disagree? I hear you. But you know, and what I found interesting, Mr. There was no proposal. So that it is clear. There was no proposal by the opposition in respect to making any amendment to the bill in the other place, because this chamber can't make any amendments to this bill. The main bone of contention seems to have been in respect to form, and that is what I got from you, Senator Scott Manley, as well as the comments that were made in the other place. There were several hours of vigorous debate, and what I also found interesting from there is that there was no meaningful proposal. We kept hearing comments about, well, it can be done this way, let us have dialogue, etc. Today I hear our goodly senator from Western Jamaica, Senator Hart, and he seemed to be criticizing in the employment opportunities that was created under this administration. And I found it a bit disturbing. Because this administration, Mr. President, was able to reduce the unemployment rate to the lowest level ever seen in Jamaica. And in my mind, and in respect to the persons with whom I've had dialogue, persons even from the constituency that he hopes to represent, is that he seems to want to prefer a person in zero. But I would think that half a loaf is better than no loaf at all. So the employment opportunities that was created to reduce the unemployment rate to 7.5%, reduce youth unemployment rate from what it was under 18 years of PNP administration to the lowest that we have ever seen, is something that he should have given commendation to the government about. And speaking about whether it is half unemployment, half a loaf is better than no loaf, Mr. President. Mr. President, you know, when I listen to the leader of the opposition in the other place, he spoke on several occasions, and he constantly repeated these words in respect to the debate. We are not opposed to the need for change in the benchmark. We may end up agreeing, but what he wanted to do was to have dialogue right across the board, have dialogue with every person throughout Jamaica, which is the chief. Mr. President, has labeled this administration, the opposition, as being the pipeline government. Everything was stuck in the pipeline for them. And all they did, Mr. President, was to talk, and some more talk, but no action. This administration is about action, Mr. President. Mr. President, the delay being proposed by the opposition to engage in this philosophical discussion over farm. What should we do? Fiddle while Rome burns? That can't be what is expected of a government that has to ensure that its people, the people of Jamaica, are taken care of. Mr. President, the context in which this bill comes before the Senate was aptly stated in an article out of the United States, which reads as follows. Since COVID-19 outbreak was first diagnosed, it has spread to over 190 countries. The pandemic is having noticeable impact on global economic growth. Estimates are that the virus could trim global economic growth by as much as 2% per month. Global trade could fall by 13% to 32%, depending on the global economic downturn. Mr. President, those words are reflected on the ground in Jamaica, and my colleague Senator Dan Webby spoke about several of them. Reduction in the government revenues by 80 billion, and to that we would have to add the new expenditure of $34 billion to meet this crisis. Mr. President, closure of businesses primarily in the tourism sector, and I'm from the tourism capital of Jamaica. Oh, man, come on, man, do better than that. Dear man. You know, it seems as if you have lost your way, you know. Mr. President, every hotel, whether large or small, in Western Jamaica is closed. The airports are empty. The attractions and the parks are closed. The drive on Jamaica Boulevard, Mr. President, as Senator Webby has said, not one business place is open on the boulevard. Mr. President, the informal sector has taken a major blow by virtue of the need for curfews and earlier closing times. No sector was spared. Lives of persons have been disrupted in the worst ways by this pandemic, not seen for over 100 years. Mr. President, I was just listening to a sports program yesterday, and they spoke about the, well, you can ask Senator Hartney, you know, because he and I went to the same institution, and if he looks on the sports board, you will see my name there. Oh, yes. I played every sport, sir. So, Mr. President, the Boston Marathon, which has been held every year for over 120 years, has been cancelled for the first time. And that speaks volumes in relation to what is happening globally. And we can look on it from the local perspective. Mr. President, when we consider that context, I find it tremendously upsetting when I listen and observe certain presentations from the opposition. And when I speak of the opposition, I'm not necessarily speaking of the persons who sit before me today. What persons? You have had numerous town halls where you have discussed these particular issues. And Mr. President, the misinformation, the misleading information that has come out. And I point to one, where the spokesman on Labour, Harris Daly, trying to relate Hurricane Katrina, which affected only a part of one state in the United States, the state of Louisiana, that he wants to compare it to this global crisis that we are presently witnessing. Mr. President, in that scenario, he spoke about being tasked by the Honourable Prime Minister at the time of having to repatriate 300 Jamaicans. What we have to look on today is a repatriation of over 9,000 Jamaicans. And in his particular situation, you would still have airlines flying, countries were open, countries were receiving his citizenship. So we have a situation where what he spoke about is something vastly different from what we are experiencing. And I want to stand with my colleague, Senator Don Webby, to commend this administration led by the Honourable Michael Rhodes and the manner in which they have managed the pandemic locally. Mr. President, no one thought it would be easy. And the road back to normalcy, or the new normal, is also likely not to be easy. But I feel, Mr. President, and I feel confident that we are in safe hands. Mr. President, part of the task of the government in taking us through the challenge of COVID-19 is the passage of this bill, and passage without delay. Mr. President, the opposition accepts. You know, what you must do, you know, instead of being as you are, Senator Brown, is to be part of the loyal opposition and one that will work in the best interest of the Jamaican people, rather than to be one where you want to dither and procrastinate. And Mr. President, don't get me wrong, dialogue is always good. Dialogue is always good. It appears that you want to dither. We have to move ahead and ensure that what was not anticipated and expected, that we are able to provide for the care packages, the compassionate grants, the set cash grants. They have not all been paid, Senator Brown, and you know that. And it appears that you, Senator Brown, do not like to hear the appreciation and gratitude expressed by the thousands of Jamaicans, such as Kemar Jones. He said, I feel gratitude. I feel good to have been able to receive a compassionate grant. There are many persons who I encountered in St. James in Montego Bay while standing in Sam Sharp Square, who said that the compassionate grant has seen them through some difficult times. It appears that the opposition does not want to hear that the infirmaries and the hospitals and the workers and the nurses, the doctors, are provided with personal protective equipment. It appears that the opposition does not want the controlled repatriation of Jamaicans in a manner that is secure and safe for those repatriated and those who are resident on the island. It appears that the opposition, Mr. President, is opposed to the government putting itself in position to ensure that there is adequate beds and equipment for COVID-19 patients on a timely basis, which is a possibility once borders are open.
Yeah, what's the point about that, Senator?
Yes, sir. The member is misleading the Senate and the country. I don't think he's worthy of a point of order being raised, but the fact of the matter is that people out there need to know that the things he's saying the opposition oppose is not true. And I rest at that.
Sir President, I speak of the comments that were made in the other place.
Just proceed with
it appears that the opposition does not wish for the public spaces to be sanitized. Oh, no. I know, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, in listening to the opposition, they speak of the constitutional correctness, parliamentary oversight, accountability. Yes, of course I want that. Listen up, Senator. But when I hear them speak of it in the manner that they have spoken about it in this particular situation, it causes me to wonder if there is a level of hypocrisy and amnesia on their part. Mr. President, they went so far as to use harsh words in the other place.
Mr. President.
What is it now, Senator Brown?
Yes. Just sit upon the order.
Yes.
Oh, but you know,
Senator Brown.
You haven't said anything.
At a moment when I am sure that both sides of the aisles feels a sense of sadness, I'd wish the member not to continue to mislead and to divide the country. This side genuinely feels the sadness of the nation at the passing of the minister. I'd urge you to take that into account and stop dividing unnecessarily.
Senator Brown, strange we have a point of order, but...
You know, Mr. President, well, I listened to what was being said in the other place by persons who sat on that side. The harsh words that were used by members of the opposition, accusing the administration of expediency, lacking in principle, doing things because it had the numbers. They went as far as to say that persons have despotic behavior. Very harsh words, Mr. President. You know, Mr. President, this is the same opposition that we have failed to speak on the $400 million fraud. You speaking about lack of transparency, and that is what it is, that you have failed to speak on the $400 million fraud at the Manchester Municipal Corporation. Mr. President, this is the same opposition. This is the same opposition that continues to support one of its members who sit in the other place, obstructing the tabling of a damning report from the Contractor General on his activities in Hanover. But they say we must have parliamentary oversight. Mr. President, the leader of the opposition, as Minister of National Security, signed a secret MOU with foreign governments that impacted the privacy of every Jamaican citizen, which he hid from his cabinet, the Prime Minister, and the Parliament and people of Jamaica. Mr. President, page 20 of the Commission of Inquiry report, which was submitted to this Parliament in relation to those secret MOUs, reads as follows. And these are the persons that speak about. These are the persons, Mr. President.
Mr. President, again on a point of order.
What is the point of order, Senator Brown? Senator Brown.
No, man, I rise on a point of order. Time for you to sit. Mr. President?
Yes, sir.
We're debating the FAA Act amendment. I don't know how secret MOU comes in. When the Prime Minister himself has said that he recognized the value and importance of such MOU, this senator has just been...
No, but Senator Brown,
he's been the he's parochial. Truth be told, he's total.
Senator Brown, I will not allow you to attempt to make your presentation during what you are considering a point of order. Allow the senator to make his presentation.
Mr. President,
that's not for you to decide.
Mr. President,
continue.
What we heard about.
Yes.
Mr. President, I'm going to make an attempt at an appeal because, Mr. President, I have just heard of the news of the passage of the Honourable Minister, and it has hit me personally hard because of the relationship that I have developed with her over the years. And it is difficult to listen to a conversation as which I am hearing and subjecting myself to. And I am appealing to you, sir, to ask the members to be cognizant of the environment now, so that, because it is clear the leader of the opposition business has signaled our intent to support the bill. But this news of the death of the Honourable Minister has jolted us, and regards must be paid to that. And I am making that appeal, sir, because it is difficult for me to concentrate and focus in this sort of environment. As a matter of fact, Mr. President, I would think
Can I
that
suggest
we would
something,
want
Senator?
to have a little break.
Can I suggest something, Senator?
Yes,
Let us suspend the debate and take a break.
absolutely. Thank you, Mr. President.
Take a 15-minute break.
Yeah, man. No, sir.
Or 10-minute break.
10.
Suspension.
Somebody need to talk.
It's rough, man.
Why
God,
foolish?
man.
We must just attack.
This Senate is now suspended.
You must know when to fold and when to hold.
So it's only you alone must say what you want to say. I don't understand what you're saying, Senator Brown.
You must know when to fold and when to hold.
Colleagues, it is, sad news in terms of the passing of the Honourable Minister of Labour, the Honourable Shahini Robinson, and it has taken a serious jolt on the entire country and the entire, all of us. And it's with sadness that one of our colleagues would have passed whilst we're conducting the nation's business. And I'm lost for words, and I'm sure many of you would have. But I think out of the deepest respect, we must rise and offer a moment of silence for our colleague. May her soul rest in peace. Please be seated.
Mr. President, the time being 1:18 also might standing orders be suspended to allow the sitting to proceed beyond 1:30 to complete the business of the day.
Question is to suspend the standing orders in order to allow the Senate to resume its duties for the rest of the day. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Sorry, Mr. President, with your leave, craving your indulgence and just
Yes,
knowing
Minister.
that at an appropriate time, we will all pay tribute. Just having sent prayers at the beginning of this session for Shahini, for her strength, for her recovery, for the easing of her pain. I just wish to note on behalf of the Senate, and recognizing that we will give tributes at an appropriate time, our sadness, the blessing that it was for all of us to know her, who knew her, to have experienced this honor, which is why people spoke about how long it took to persuade her to join and to run when she did in 2001. But again, not to pay the tribute at this time, but just as we had recognized the matter and we have just paid a moment of silence, Mr. President, I just ask that this House recognize the blessing that was the life of the Honourable Shahini Robinson. May her soul rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
I know it's not intended to pay tribute, but this morning
It's understood.
This morning when I raised and asked for prayers for her, I never expected to get this news. Because I've known her for a very, very long time, about a little longer than I've known you, because of that same program, the training for the campaign managers, and I've always been struck. I found her just to be a real person, not like a partisan person, but just a real person who wanted to serve. She's loved across both parties. I mean, if you ever see the condolences and the sympathy that are going through all the different chats, you will know she was a special person. Because when you can be on a different side and everybody feel a sense of loss, that is a testament and a testimony to who you are. At the appropriate time, we will all say goodbye. Mr. President, you know it's going to happen. You know it's inevitable, and then it comes and it hits you like a ton of bricks. May her soul rest in peace, and light perpetual shine upon her.
Thank you, Senator Scott Motley. You know, I know how we all feel and what this would have done at this particular moment. But colleagues, I would want to suggest that we pay her that level of respect to make our tributes in all at the most appropriate time. I really think she deserves that. And I'd want to suggest, we have from the leader of government business and the leader of opposition business, but I urge and encourage us, let us just reflect upon her passing and, indicate that she might be at a better place now. And the time will come for us to appropriately offer her tribute.
Yes. Yeah, man, it's on. Mr. President, I have to look at the comments that have been made, because it seems to be so, Mr. President, when one had looked at the Commission of Inquiry report, particularly at page 20 of the Commission of Inquiry report, which was submitted to this Parliament, that touched upon a particular that looked on a particular issue. Mr. President, in relation to the secret MOUs, it read as follows. It follows that in MOUs that communications intercepts are to be shared with the DA, and any sharing of such purportedly per to them do not seem to us capable of being under the authority of the Interception of Communication Act. If they are not under such authority, it follows that they would be in breach of the Constitution. So we have a situation, approach matter with transparency and accountability by the fact that the Honourable Prime Minister has made every present to this Parliament for debate. Mr. President, the confidence of the IMF has been expressed in these words. The Jamaican authorities' policy response to the COVID-19 crisis.
I will only acknowledge the passing and will await time for the correct methodology. But as a member who's on his feet, I will just acknowledge the passing of Mrs. Shiny Robinson. And with that in mind, I'll also try my best to be sober in how I deliver and to be as brief as possible. Openly affected can grieve in private, more so than in public. Mr. President, I believe that there are some things that needs to be said before this bill is approved. And there are some statements that were made, one of which was made by Senator Don Webby. And he correctly said that a crisis is at the point where correct action, if not taken, will lead to grave circumstance. That's what a crisis is. that if immediate corrective action isn't taken, then the outcome will be grave and negative. And so, once there is a crisis, not only there needs to be action, but there needs to be effective action. Incorrect action taken at the point of a crisis will exaggerate the grave circumstance that one would inherit. And so, I heard the good senator from and councillor from St. James says, should the government fiddle while Rome burns? And it's an important question to analyze, to address, because when you're talking about should you fiddle, you should speak to should you fiddle in consideration, which is period before crisis, and should you politics and say we need a change now. We don't assume that it have a direction. It can be a positive or a negative change. And also it have a distance. It can change 10 folds, 20 folds, 30 folds. So it can change positive, barely change, or it can change positive, dramatically change. So the vector have to have a distance, a large magnitude, a magnitude. Thank you very much, Senator Skeffrey. And so when we are discussing this, I think everybody believes that there's a crisis and there's a need for change. And I think everybody agree with the direction of the change, that there's a need to reduce or to extend the time. But we don't all agree on the magnitude. This year is asking us to agree on the direction to say 60% and the magnitude 2 years. I might believe it's 5. I might believe it's 4. I might believe it's 1. But there is so little conversation and communication coming to me that I don't know the variables considered to say that 60% can be achieved in 2. So how is it that I must cooperate automatically when I don't know? Because, and I'm going to come back, Senator Webb, you made an excellent presentation. And what I love about you, you're improving in breaking down things. Yeah, that the regular man who don't have your information is a very difficult thing, you know. The people who are more informed often speak without acknowledging that some people are less informed. And so with your information, you say that is a mathematics of a numerator and a denominator. A look at CXC man now say, oh yeah, it's like a fraction. So therefore, we're saying that the debt to GDP, meaning that is a ratio of debt to GDP, meaning that one is the numerator, the dependent variable, and one is the denominator, the independent variable. So we have to consider both if we're going to achieve a percent. We have to consider, firstly, the independent variable, the GDP. So what is the assumed GDP and what is the assumed debt? Are you understanding what I'm saying? And therefore, I need information to say this is likely to be achieved in the 2-year period. So let us look. Let me say this is a reasonable, or let us suggest 3, because I don't think it would make sense for the fiscal responsibility rules if over the next 5 years we come back 3 times. It wouldn't make sense. So make a look on the GDP part. The GDP has both the formal and the informal consideration. I spoke to the chief economist here, and he says the only thing the GDP really consider is the illegal economy. But it considers as best as it can the informal, and it considers the formal. Now, as we go further in economics, we're going to say some of the illegal might even leak into the formal and the informal, but it doesn't in itself consider the illegal. So when we look on GDP, one must be able to analyze what are the expectations for the formal aspects of the economy and what are the expectations of the informal. Therefore, how can we legitimately debate this when we don't know the expected time of opening tourism or the projected time? Because the GDP will be affected if it is June 1st versus September 1st versus December 1st versus 2021. So therefore, the assumption of 5.1 is based on a timeline that must must be in the minds, but I see in the newspaper the tourism and the PSOJ demanding communication of that time that has not been communicated. What is the reason if it is acknowledged? If it is not acknowledged, this 5.1 is taken from the sky. If there is no estimate in our minds of when tourism, which is 30-something%, I think the minister said it is underestimated, is 70% when all linkages is considered. If tourism opening time isn't considered, then how we reach 5.1? And if it is considered, why cannot be communicated? Anybody in a business know that, Senator Albin. I can't call it Senator Albin in the Senate. Senator Hill. Yeah, but when we're having a tea, but in the Senate. You know that business is the game of risk. The man who got to him job and get him pay is most times less risk accepting than the man who go every day and might not get paid. Therefore, knowledge and risk being inversely related, meaning more knowledge indicates less risk and less knowledge indicate more risk, means that it is reasonable for a businessman, in this case a hotelier, to demand knowledge of the government's expected time of opening, so that we can come to this conclusion. We look again on the GDP within the formal sector, and Senator Hart was speaking to some of these issues. What do you expect of manufacturing? What do you expect of support services? Because one of the things I'm predicting now is that when the hotels open, the support services, having suffered so dramatically, may not be able to respond satisfactorily, and in the short term to hotel demand, leading to greater importation. Senator from West Sinclair, I can speak for myself and my industry, eggs. Most of us have killed some of our birds. Some people up to 50% of their birds. Right? Because from my 300 case a week, hotels was 140, 160. The others were cakes, which reduced because schools are closed. But may I focus on the hotel portion, it went to 0. 140 to 0. I can't continue since the last 12 weeks to produce, so I kill some of my birds. It takes 21 weeks for a bird to start laying. I will not buy any bird till the hotel open, because I can't waste my money and feed bird. When the hotel open and say, come to Jamaica, and them say, oh, Bounty Beanie, or whatever they want to say, sun, sun, and sea, and they come down, I will be 21 weeks away. At minimum, assuming I can get bird. What the hotel is going to do in that period? It's going to start to import. If no open back, that's why I may watch. That's why I don't want to act. But any amount that he needs, he will have to import because we are incapable. Has that been considered in the 5.1%? Or do you assume that the support systems immediately start up when the hotels start up? I can't accept 2 years if I don't know that. What are we?
Are we equal to February 4th?
Exactly. It seems as if we have taken the most primitive of economic premise to say all things being held constant. What you call that, Senator Horton, ceteris paribus? But it is never ceteris paribus. We have to look again, Senator Webby, and I'm saying, what is your presumption on the calculation of energy, in this case fuel, coming through the place Petroja? Because it has been indicated that there are flaws within that calculation, and if this flaw is corrected, then it means that there will be losses to the... No, Mr. President, my mother spoke to me last week. She said, anytime I'm disrupted, I must start over. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's for your household, you know, not the parliament.
No. She said she don't like when I get angry.
We're not going to allow you to start over today.
Yes. No. This one thing my mother never made me again. But what I'm saying is this. If we expect the manufacturing industry to take up some of the slack for the tourism losses, then we have to speak to seeking new markets. Senator Webby speaks to that all the time about exporting. Exporting is based on quality competitiveness and price competitiveness. You have to have good quality and you have to can compete with price. Therefore, your costs impact your ability to export. Now, currently, energy costs as it relates to fuel is being, what do I say now, incorrectly high, artificially high by how it is calculated from oil coming in to gas coming to us. If that is to be corrected to facilitate development, that affects government resources. How much you have to pay the debt. And therefore, if we don't know the actions on that, how can I assume that either GDP is going to increase because I can be more efficient, or that your revenue are going to reduce because you are giving up money that you used to get? I saw, to my chagrin, is that the current pronunciation, Senator? Yes, because I'm expanding my vocabulary, you know? Yes. JPS expects an increase in energy bill. Now, remember, I just told you that may lose 140. Most of the people in my manufacturing business who have cold storage is seeking to store as long as possible. Some egg farmers call me if I cannot produce and freeze, which give me a 1-year shelf life on their behalf. I say, you mad? When I freeze in, who pay? I can't freeze. I have to get this out of my fridge today. And for some reason, when I expected that JPS would have been giving us a reduction because of the input oil, I get to learn that somehow there's an agreement that we have to buy the LNG. That there is an automatic purchase of LNG regardless of the fact that you can switch between oil and LNG. We agreed with the LNG provider that we have to buy LNG, which is about 20 times now the price of oil. Senator Hill, are you aware of that? That there's a minimum purchase of LNG that must be made? Sorry? And are you aware that LNG is now much higher in cost than oil?
It was put together by the ENT, that group led by Decent.
All right. So now that we know, now that we know where it started, I cannot agree to either a GDP increase or a government cost income reduction if I don't know where you're going with this. If I don't know where you're going with the cost of energy, then I cannot assume that Senator Don Webby will be able to sell more product cheaper.
You want perfect information. It doesn't exist.
No, we want some information. And even the basis of your projections on how much COVID cases will happen has been secret. No, but I don't think you understand. I'm not being distracted. But there is a teacher in me that likes to enlighten the unenlightened.
Senator, go ahead with your presentation, man.
If we're discussing in 2 years, how projecting the alternative to oil in 5 years me can make a decision for 2 years? So, but you don't really understand. There is also a demand push and supply side inflation concepts that we can discuss. because there's a tax on gas that impacts, Senator Harton spoke to it, the cost of business, that impacts the ability to move around, that I don't know what you're going, what direction you're going with that. If you remove the tax on gas, then how are you going to pay the debt? And if you don't remove the tax on gas, then how's the GDP going to increase? We have to consider those things. The other thing we have to consider is, what do you project for the tourism industry? Senator Webby, I've been watching the news keenly. You know what is happening in Europe now? They're promoting domestic, meaning intra-Europe travel. Now, most times I say domestic is inter-country, but because the EU is operating as a singular country, it creates an even bigger thing than I did expect, because maybe a man say, I don't want to stay in my country, but now he has an alternative to drive to Spain. As versus go to an airport, take a plane, expose himself to more people in transit. He now can take his family and drive. That is a significant competitive advantage. It's the same thing America doing. They're saying that it is patriotic to travel locally. So even with opening, you have to give me a projection that we assume 60% recovery, 80% recovery. We haven't seen it. The other thing is, the major reason why we try to get these fiscal rules, Mr. President, is because for a long time, every dollar where we have, 80% was not ours. 80 cents was not ours. School couldn't get any. Hospital couldn't get any. All those things. I see this thing here, where it says that we need to do it so that we can allocate resources for employees care program and health activities, etc. You know what I don't see in it, Mr. President? I don't see education in it. So I start to wonder if we overestimate how much money we have to pay the debt. Senator Sinclair, there's been a grave misunderstanding of the education system by the government. So much so that we're about to sacrifice our children at the altar of inefficiency and incompetence. The minister, who's a good friend of mine, a man who looked out for me when I was in the lower house, gave me good advice, taught me how to stand properly, focus over the other side. He says, introducing the 5th and 6th forms will be easy because they're the only ones that will be in school. Maybe easy for the canteen. But it can't be easy for the classroom because there's one teacher to 40. So until you can say no more than 15 to a classroom, which means that you then must multiply the number of teachers, which means that the cost to the government increase. How am I going to pay the debt? We not consider that when you reach to the class, mathematics, class 11A1, 11A1 historically had a stacking rate of 42 people to the class. Social distancing suggests 15 people to the class. So 11A1 need 3 maths teachers now instead of 2. Then this blow up then, if that is the reality. And it even further blow up because there will be infrastructure change when all the classes start going. Until I know the plan for education, we can't say that we have the ability to fit into what we have here. The minister went further to say, from a question from, I think it was Member of Parliament Bunting. Member of Parliament Bunting asked, what about private schools? He said that there is no arrangements for private schools. And he went further to say because they're private. Now, there's arrangements for private hotels. There's arrangement for private businesses. But there's no arrangement for private school. Senator Samuda, you know what that means? It means that those that fail, the government now have to take them up into our schools. That is counterproductive to social distancing. because you already have a problem with spaces, you already have a stocking rate issue, number of people to a class, and you are risking 40,000 more, let us say 50%, 20,000 more, seeking a space in the public school. So we might have to build some more school, you know. We might have to build more, whether primary or secondary school, to achieve social distancing. How that affect the 5.1%? How that affects 60% in 2 years? These are things where we have to discuss and consider, or should have discussed and consider. But we have not. Then I come now to the informal sector. Most of the rebooting activities, Senator Sinclair, I don't want you distract Senator Webby, because he has great influence in the government. He can make some of these things happen. I am. I think I've ADD through the beating where we used to get. But Senator, most of what I hear considered is for the formal. But we have acknowledged the size of the informal industry in Jamaica. Most of the recovery, most of the care package is for the formal. You know that entertainment industry was not considered under any care package. When entertainment industry is at least equally affected to tourism. May I say at least, because it might have more. Because sometimes when you start a little bit, you're dead quicker. The entertainment industry has not been considered. Neither the girl who used to make her money by wearing promotional clothes, the person who used to keep a weekly event, the people who used to be a selector, the man who used to be a security or a bouncer, none of those have been considered. Now that contributes greatly to our GDP. Ask Red Stripe about it. So if entertainment don't reboot quickly, how much you expect to make from Red Stripe? Who can tell us there's about 11,000 bars who keep round robbing, and we have no plan for that? The bars that don't have registration, the majority of the bars, were not considered under the care package. The informality of his, true, but him also use CB chicken and best dressed chicken, who has stated them down nearly 50% best dressed. So because we see supermarket full, we don't recognize that 90% of the chicken we buy at KFC is en route to home. Have we considered the impact of the care package on community shops? If you put $4 billion worth of food into communities, then a man must buy less food from the shop. But because he's not formal, we don't consider him. But that got impact. How can you say that if you're not registered as a bar, you can't get the care package when you are known to be a bar? Yes, you should have registered. But is starvation sufficient or reasonable punishment? All I'm saying is, at this time in a crisis, when you know that of the 11,000 bars, 8,000 had up a sign, I intend to. Now, entertainment what? Entertainment what? Covered in the 17 billion. Let me give you another example. In tourism, you have some craft markets. I'll give you some of the names of the craft market. You have a craft market called Fantasy Craft Market. It's about 40 years old now. You know it? It's a legal craft market. You call it a illegal craft market, but it's a craft market, none the same. Huh? Maybe, but I know it's craft, and they come to even meet. I know because I was in the ministry. And that Fantasy Craft Market have been having issues for a very long time, because fantasy, the person who owned the land, we can't find the person. But it did it for years, you know. Might have over 20 years. We have a crisis. These people used to survive from craft. We acknowledge that. How can they not be in the care package? We go further. Success. Craft market, same thing. We go further. You see, that's the type of government we have. Anytime you tell the truth, them just say, yeah, we're ready. But I not said work. No, they were said not to be a part of it. Fern Gully, who all are we know because of the size of the members in the gully. They are told they're not a legitimate craft market when those people survive by selling craft. Is it reasonable for starvation to be the penalty of not being formal? And how? I am sorry. Huh? Oh, yeah, as I can. But you must agree, these things are necessary.
No, I don't think we agree. But Mr. President, the Speaker's time having expired, might he be permitted to continue to complete his?
You heard the question. Those in favor?
I
Continue,
apologize,
Senator
but
Crawford.
no. You see, I believe that these things are necessary to consider. Because if 30% of the vendors cannot recover when tourism recover, each craft vendor must get 40,000, I understand. And you have said 4 or 5 of them to say they don't qualify. Then how we are going to get that GCT? How we are going to get that consumption? How we are going to get those taxes that you expect to achieve the 60% in 2 years? There's another set of people who we have punished for crimes that are not theirs. The workers in some of the hotels who hasn't paid over their taxes. Now, how is that the responsibility of the worker to bear? By saying he can't get the care package because his entity who should have paid did not pay. All we needed was to have a system that the hotel send a list of its workers, and those that you prove have not been paying over, then you go to them with tax office to say that you must pay over, not to facilitate the worker, to facilitate your getting back your tourism license or something else. How is it the worker? You're a trade union man. And I think you understand justice. There's a term for it that I can't remember, and I'll ask Senator Braham to remind me. But how is it justice that a activity not in your control is a disqualifier of you in a time of crisis? How is that justice? And how do we expect them to recover going forward? We have to analyze that. And so, therefore, I believe that we agree that something have to change because of the circumstance that we face. I think we agree that we have to delay the achievement of the goal of 60% of GDP. But I don't agree that we have enough information to say 2 years is sufficient. And I think that is why the leader of the opposition was suggesting that more communication and more debate should have been had. All of that could have been achieved, and we still pass it today. It is not us that decided to bring it late. It is you. With that, Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you, Senator Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thanks to all colleagues for their contribution to the debate today. Mr. President, my closing will be short, just to pick up on just a few points to... No, it's fine. Thank you. No, it's fine. I will be brief. Just to pick up on a few points that were raised. One, in respect of the focus on agriculture and the need to grow. These are points on which we can agree and acknowledge that in the most recent announcement made by the PIOJ, it was recognized that even in the face of the 1.7% decline in the economy, we did experience a 7.8% growth in agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, and this is something that absolutely is a testament not only to the industry or farmers, but to the efforts that were made by the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture, and Fisheries, and through the RADA, to ensure that there was a focus on ensuring that productivity was maintained, that support was given to the farmers, and not to mention the work that has been done over the last few years in respect of irrigation and farm road rehabilitation, which I believe was acknowledged even by former Senator Norman Grant, I believe it was a year or two ago, recognizing the work that was done regarding irrigation, and farm roads, which had ensured productivity in the agricultural sphere. I also want to just point out that in the COVID expenditure that is programmed, there is $1 billion that has been programmed through the supplementary to support farmers and fisher folk in respect of cushioning the blow of the pandemic on their operations, their enterprise. So I want to just assure the senator who raised the points that this administration absolutely believes in agriculture, it believes in our farmers, it believes in our fishers, and it believes in ensuring that that all the productive sectors are in fact cushioned as best as possible and supported back into productivity as needed. I also, Mr. President, want to make the point in respect of water that we have in fact provided $800 million for rural water development, and that was not for trucking, that was for new infrastructure, new pumping plants, new catchment facilities, fixing facilities that had been not maintained for so many years, that they were could have been rehabilitated in order to bring water to the people. Not to mention the hundreds of millions of dollars spent in bringing water to St. Elizabeth in particular, to various districts in St. Elizabeth, and the billions of dollars provided to the Water Commission to roll out and fix infrastructure to reduce leakage and ensure that more people are getting more water across the island. So again, this is a matter that needs to be clarified for the record. Mr. President, I want to also, just for the record, assure the Senate and the public who may be listening that while it is that there may be details which the opposition seeks in terms of understanding what is being considered, and while it appears that some are prepared to draw the conclusion that because it has not been uttered, it is not being considered, and therefore matters like how you balance formality versus informality, how you incentivize persons to actually formalize so that the economy itself can grow, and that you don't incentivize informality by always justifying and granting and, by always ensuring that there's a workaround, that you fix the systems and allow us all to grow together. These matters are being considered, Mr. President, the matters of how we address education and the return to schooling, how we deal with the new normal. These matters are being thought through. The fact is that we will never be able to only identify binary solutions. It cannot be that it would only be by the increase in number of teachers and classrooms and schools that our children return to school. It must be that there are solutions that are found in terms of a balanced use of technology and the physical space. If we did not have enough schools before, how, Mr. President, does it become logical to say then that no, that would be the solution? So it is not the obvious black and white binary choices that face us. It is the creativity of this administration, its consultations, its work and taking of technical advice of the persons employed within the public service to so guide, that we will come through. I want to assure the senator who raised the matter about entertainment, etc., that apart from Minister Grange, there are representatives of the entertainment industry on the economic task force for recovery from COVID-19, and on the tourism task force as well, so that there is a holistic approach that's being brought to the thinking around how, yes, the informal and the formal will be supported, and how we take new approaches to our recovery. Mr. President, the IMF, as pointed out earlier, recognized the 2-year suspension as modest, but it endorsed it as a reasonable approach to take, as had the opposition spokesperson on May 13 when the supplementary estimates were presented, and the minister had advised for the second time that it would be requiring a 2-year suspension, or that it would be based on a 2-year suspension. It was approved at that time. He had also indicated it in March when the budget was tabled, the actual estimates were tabled, that it was a likelihood, Mr. President. So we have been planning, we have been working, as I indicated in my opening. The fact is that in order to take decisions and to move forward, you would need to have some information as a basis to assess your next steps. We recognize that the pandemic has created uncertainties of a scale that those, all over the world, academics, economists, policymakers, and public administrators globally struggle with the uncertainties and the vicissitudes and the variations that COVID presents us. The word unprecedented is repeated all the time for a reason. The fact is that for anyone to stand forward and say they have all the answers, they knew from before, they understood, and once we were aware of the virus, then everything should have made clear, is underestimating the scope of the problem that we are seeking to address, Mr. President, and underestimating the complexity that has even gotten us here, much less what lies ahead. What I can say about that 2-year suspension, Mr. President, is that the government is committed to working towards that target, to getting Jamaica and Jamaicans back on track, to ensuring that the decisions are taken that are balanced, that take consideration to the impact on people, as well as ensuring that the livelihoods that support those people and their families are also not only protected, but built and enhanced. So with that, Mr. President, I want to just express appreciation for the general support for the passage of the bill that has been expressed today, and to ask, Mr. President, that the bill be approved.
Thank you very much, Minister. The question is that the bill be read for a second time. Those in favour? Against?
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act read a second time.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. The Senate will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole Senate to consider the bill clause by clause. Thank you, members. I put clause 1. Those in favour? Against? I put clause 2. Those in favour? Against? I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favour? Against? The question is that I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Those in favour? Against? I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without amendment. Minister?
Mr. President, I ask for third reading of the bill.
The question is that the bill be read for a third time. Those in favour? Against?
A bill entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Administration and Audit Act read a third time and passed.
Thank you very much. Minister?
Mr. President, it is not intended to do any further business today. Pardon me? Sorry. It's not intended to do any further business today. Might I ask that the Senate be adjourned for a date to be fixed?
The question is that the Senate be adjourned for a date to be fixed. Those in favour? Against? This Honourable Senate now stands adjourned.